Great. Hi, my name is Ilani Casey. I'm an enrolled tribal member of the Tlingit Nation Raven Frog Clan, born and raised in Seattle, and the board chair of Nakanni Native Program. Nakanni is a Tlingit word that means go-between. And so we have a lot of programs going on right now, one of which is with Healthier Here, and doing these kinds of Zoom educational information pieces that we are recording and then we'll be sharing on our website. And we have a couple of other events going on. We also have the Stand Up to Oil grant, so that we're doing work along that's very similar to this, but describing the impact of oil and climate to Mother Earth, the climate crisis, and the Medicaid transformation, as well as the traditional medicine. And we also very much are involved with the, let me close that, with the canoe journey, of which it's been on hold this year because of COVID-19. And I will be doing a welcoming song. And isn't after Jeff, would you like to add anything else?
Well, thank you, Ilani. And yes, really glad to have Solana Booth with us today. She is an amazing person. I kind of think of her as a Renaissance person, if that's okay. She doesn't mind that title. And she's just has a wide range of interests, and she's experts in many things, including pre and perinatal care. And she's also a canoe skipper, really good one. And so I'm really glad she's here today. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. He's our executive director of Nakanni Native Program, also in Seattle. Okay, I'll do a very brief welcoming song, and we will go from there. Way, 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 hey. Way, 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 hey. Ah, 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 way, hey, way, hey, way, 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 hey, way, 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 hey, ah, 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 way, hey, way, hey, way, 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 hey, way, 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 hey, ah, way, hey, way, hey. Ganeshish, that means thank you in Tlingit. Ganeshish. Go ahead, Solana.
Thank you, Ilani. Thank you, Jeff. I love that song, Ilani. It just always brings me back into the canoe, out there skippering. Brings me further back to when I was first introduced into canoe journeys, and just how powerful singing that song is. Just reminds me of our ancestors and the power we get from singing the song, the power we get from hearing that song and being on the water. So thank you so much. I love your voice. Thank you. Jonathan, if we can start sharing the PowerPoint, that would be great. And we're going to go through the first two slides, take a pause, and introduce folks. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so Timakochi Chante Tinaguz Nalak Suaida. Aisquatachi CISCM. Ishene Waji Dawayu. White Owl House of the Wolf. In Ganhara Dawawatku. Violet and William Booth. Rita George Anderson Ortiz. Chieftain George, Chief Joe Ortiz. Evelyn Atkinson, Dawawanuth. My name is Solana Booth, as Ilani and Jeff mentioned. Mother, grandmother, proud grandmother, traditional canoe skipper, hunter, gatherer, traditional medicine keeper, generational trauma recovery practitioner, birth and death worker, principal consultant for Advocates of Sacred, and that's who's presenting today. Recently, because of the COVID pandemic, I've been facilitating diversity, equity, and inclusion to city and county workers from south of King County all the way north to Lummi, Bellingham area, and generational trauma for providers to help serve folks deeper on a more sustainable level for Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ, and pregnant people and our young families. Because of the current civil unrest, there's been a lot of work that's been needed. And I'm so thankful and honored to be invited by Nakani to present on an aid to that civil unrest, on a first aid is what we called it, because our traditional medicines, as you'll be reminded of as we go through the PowerPoint today, is all we've ever needed. Prior to colonial contact, prior to prisons, prior to mental institutions, prior to antidepressants, prior to social media, depression, suicide, substance use disorders, and rape, MMIW. So prior to all these current issues and barriers that people have to their highest selves, we had our first aids, we had traditional medicines, and we had protocols to go with that. In this slide is a Northwest Coastal traditional chilcat woven blanket, and it's just an example of how intricate and how precious and how true our lives can be, because our art is an example of what's happening. Our art is an expression of our life. Again, we'll go over more. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we can just real quick, housekeeping, everyone's doing great at muting their sound. Keep your video on, that would be nice. And use the chat box if there's any other questions or follow-up needed. Feel free to take notes, because there's a lot of content today. There's a lot of content, and I have a feeling that we might not be able to go over everything. I am going to forward the presentation to Nakani, and they can forward it to whomever. And you could also reach me at Advocates of Sacred, and I'll get you the information as well. Next slide. Okay, so we can, before we delve into our first aids, traditional medicines, first foods, plants, roots, stories, ceremony, if we can just do a quick introduction, I would love to see who's on here, just because there's not that many folks, and it just feels like a powerful group today. So if we can put the PowerPoint down so people can speak, that would be great.
So I'll go first. My name is Jonathan Betzall. I am of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, recent immigrants to this continent less than 120 years ago. I live in Duwamish territory in the middle of Seattle.
Carlo, do you want to go next? Nikosh? You have to unmute. There you go.
Here we go. Do we have audio?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I am Nikush Carlo. I'm Koyukon Athabaskan from the interior region of Alaska. I was born and raised in Fairbanks and in the village of Tanana. And I am joined today from the unceded and traditional territory of the Duwamish people, also in the middle of Seattle. So it's wonderful to see everyone.
Anishish. Dove, do you want to introduce yourself, Dove?
I'm Dove John. I'm African American. I used to say I'm Native American, but I'm not sure right now. And I'm on Beacon Hill.
I'm Jeff Smith, and Makah Tribal member, Executive Director of Nakanni Native Program. I live in Shoreline and in the territory of Coast Salish, Duwamish, Suquamish, and other really nice tribes. So glad to be here.
Okay, and you already heard from me. I'm Ilani Casey, enrolled tribal member of the Tlingit Nation, Raven Frog Clan, born and raised in Seattle. And I live in Seattle. Okay.
And Janice?
Hi, Janice Heinga Lonergan, Tsimshian, Blackfoot, and European descent. I reside on the Duwamish territory in South Seattle. And right now I'm grandma babysitting, so my 2-year-old. So if I disappear, so nice to be here. Thank you, Solana and Eleni and everyone.
Looks like that. Oh.
Want to put this share screen?
Yep. And looks like Stephen is the only one that didn't get to introduce themselves. If they're not ready, that's fine. So we can keep going forward. I'm just going to write in the chat that they can introduce themselves when they're ready. And we can pull the PowerPoint back up.
We have like about 25 minutes. We got to get going here.
Yes. So as I was saying, traditional medicines, first aids, AOS acknowledges our first foods, and that's copyrighted as your tribal or region's pre-contact foods. So I heard Tsimshian, Duwamish, Makah, Ojibwe, Tlingit. I heard different tribal nations, Jewish, different entities, different folks, different regions of the world that people are coming from, that our ancestors originated from. And we acknowledge first foods as where the origin of your people is from. So the reason why we do that is that eating our first foods exemplifies and promotes a physiological, biological, epigenetic, and social emotional interconnection for whole health wellness. And I'll explain why. First foods can minimize the effects of the 5-HTT-LPR gene. It's a polymorphism. And this gene was studied or discovered in the 80s. And they call it the mutant gene. And this is part of the activist in me, is that they call it the mutant gene because all indigenous and people of color people have the 5-HTT-LPR polymorphism, which they call the mutant gene. So that means that when we don't feel or we're not active in a collectivist culture activity, event, experience, we can get depressed. So that mutant gene, collectivist culture gene, inhibits and misleads the serotonin levels. So the neurological and biological effects of foods being multiplied, 10 times in your guts than in your brain, of course, you're going to deduce the effects of the mutant gene. It's the 5-HTT LPR polymorphism. It's called the mutant gene. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because eating first foods is going to allow you to be connected to your ancestors. I know that all of us have experienced a moment when we took a bite of a food at a gathering or a ceremony or event, and our insides just kind of burst open. Our insides just kind of woke up. And for me, it's always been salmon. It's been fish eggs. It's been ooligan grease, seaweed, buffalo, elk, deer, just certain first foods for me where I feel even more awake inside, even more alive. That oxytocin release, that serotonin balancing is part of a collectivist culture. The thing that the researchers in medical journals are not saying about this mutant gene is that they're not admitting that our foods are part of our culture. They're not admitting that because they want to keep all of our parts, our physical, our emotional, our mental, our spiritual selves separate. And God forbid any of us feel emotions, right? Because it's mind, body, spirit. And God forbid any of us feed ourselves actual food that belongs to us by birthrights, by ancestral lineage, by our protocols. So for me, that's the most important thing about first foods is since 2016, it's not been about food sovereignty. It's been about debilitating the effects of the mutant gene. It's been about the neuro, bio, psychosocial, emotional, spiritual connection that we can employ when we eat our first foods, when we partner with our first plants, when we are taking a hike in the woods and we find some berries, or we rediscover a plant, a helper. So I'm breezing through a little bit. And one last thing about our first foods, I mentioned the biopsychosocial, emotional, spiritual benefits. Of course, there's so much more nutritional and physical benefits, just as our ancestors did. I talked about hiking, harvesting, in the rain, in the dry heat, the emotional and spiritual connection of just being among the cedars, among the trees, among the helpers, among the rememberers who were standing when our ancestors were here. It's just important to at least be part of a moment of the first foods experience. So whether you're on the receiving end, if somebody brings you some nettles, berries, wild game, fish, eating that first food is going to feed your inner ancestor. It's going to feed your inner Indian. You're going to debilitate that effect of the mutant gene. And we are also going to provide a short list of certain first foods. Next slide. Perfect. Oops. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so this is, oh, sorry, where'd my video go? This is a quote from a relative of mine, my great-great-grandfather. The Chieftain George family was segregated into two different families. So when colonizers came, they had to choose smokehouse or Catholicism. And so there goes the segregation of the family. The thing I like about this quote is it's about traditional medicine. And advocates of sacred will always find traditional medicine and figure out a way that traditional medicine can solve the issue. Here's an example. We have taken so much from your culture. I wish you had taken something from ours. For there were some beautiful and good things within it. And perhaps now that the time has come, we are fearful that what you take will be lost. I shall grab the instruments of the white man's success, his education, his skills, and his society. That's a heavy quote for me. And again, this is about traditional medicines. Looking at this photo is a traditional potlatch. There's quaquaquaqueal masks, spirit masks in it. There's totem poles in the image as well. Dirt floor, it's a actual longhouse photo. And AOS acknowledges that right now in 2020, through the pandemic, the civil unrest, the racism, MMIW, our grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren, there's no room for fear in our way of life today. I know that Chieftain George did the best he could to steer the people towards peace and love, because that's our clan, is White Owl House of the Wolf. It's to bestow peace for themselves and for our way of life. AOS is inviting you to reclaim your natural birthright, your truth, your relationship to our first foods, stories, medicines, and reintroduce a protocol for you to do that. I'm just going to take a breath and ask if there's any questions or comments or anything before I keep going forward. Anybody?
So, did you say something about where that picture's from?
This image?
Yeah.
It's from a Vancouver Islands longhouse potlatch. It's you can see the quaquaquaqueal spirit masks. Hold on. I can email you where I got it from if you would like.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to keep going forward, and hopefully everyone's following, and I really appreciate this time to reflect on our first aids, on our traditional medicines. So Advocates of Sacred going forward also acknowledges the generational trauma, the historical trauma, and so we're further inclined to promote a strength-based, all-inclusive relationship with our first aids, our plants, our foods, our stories, and each other. The best part about our Earth Mother is that she's always prepared to show us examples of that protocol. She's always prepared to show us what our attributes can look like in nature. So if you look outside, you'll see right away that the ocean floor is not jealous or envious of the seaweed, and that the tide doesn't stop. It's disciplined and committed to the moon. You'll see that the stars are always ready for the dark, and they don't exploit the night, so they see in the dark. Like, there's just so many rules and natural laws outside all the time that show what our highest selves and what our attributes can look like with one another. And in particular, our plants, our medicines, our roots. There's a protocol to not only be out foraging for them, to find them, to harvest them. There's a certain time of the year that we really need to obtain certain plants and foods outside. Same with wild game. There's certain like best hunting times to be out there. And again, through the civil unrest, through the pandemic, going back into another traditional medicine, such as stories and storytelling. There are two types of stories and storytelling, and both of them are important. There's remember when stories, and there's creation stories. And creation stories have been shared in every culture as a means of education, cultural preservation, and instilling moral values, instilling protocol, instilling like ways of our highest selves, or mistakes that have been made so that you can learn from other people's mistakes instead of make them on your own. Stories are employed to weave relationships among peoples, families, collaborations among tribes, nations, traditional ceremonies, programs, local organizations, religious groups, and corporations. So Advocates of Sacred wrote a curriculum around first narratives to promote whole health, including physiological, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Most importantly, first narratives are designed to hold and keep a natural order in the environment and nature, and replicate protocol as to how things are created and sustained. So again, like I said in the very first few minutes of this presentation, I mentioned that prior to prisons, prior to mental institutions, prior to birth outcomes such as SIDS, prior to substance use disorder, prior to pregnant people conditions that can really hurt the mama, prior to domestic violence, prior to rape, prior to families being split apart, prior to all these things, all these barriers that we are facing, marginalization. We had our first stories, we had storytelling, we had our first plants, our first foods, our first aids. And these narratives are interpretations of exemplary disciplines, multiple personality traits and virtues, tested and true events, pushing the inevitable effects of the original cause of strife. So in every culture, there's these first narratives. In every culture, there's these creation stories. In every religion, in every ceremony, there's a creation story behind it. And I guarantee you that the last 500 years or so, at least for the North American continent, there's been a retelling of those stories with a trauma lens. And so that's also what Advocates of Sacred has been doing, is reinterpreting those ceremony creation stories without the trauma lens. Because I guarantee you that every generation is doing the best they can, and not just better than. We're going to go into that in the next slide as to exactly what I mean by that. The 5 parts of our first narratives are trauma, witness, helpers, elders, and reconciliation. Part of that reconciliation is service. So in every creation story, there's a trauma. In every creation story, there's an event and or experience causing strain, damage, confusion of the mind, emotional state, physical body, or spirit, either individually or collectively. Now, to back up a little bit, when a trauma happens, it means our voice, choice, and power is taken. And so it can be as simple as something that made you frown, something that made you cry, something that made you hold your breath just for a second. So in every creation story, there's a trauma. There's something that happens. In every creation story, there's a witness. The witness can be any kind of being. It can be part of nature. It can be, part of the environment, such as the trees, plants, animals, the stars, or people. It's always most helpful when it's a person, because then you get to hear their physical voice and you get to see their emotional reaction to what they witnessed. The third part of every creation story is that there's a helper or an elder. So this being becomes informed of the trauma or was already aware and is aligned with a potential solution for a progressive movement or action to employ an all-inclusive reconciliation. So that inclusive reconciliation is going to be most sustainable. And the fourth part that's in, oh, there you are. The fourth part that's in every creation story is reconciliation. So we talked about the trauma, the witness, the helper, elder. Now we're on reconciliation. And this reconciliation, just even saying that, I feel like can be triggering for some people. A lot of religious groups and churches have kind of claimed that term, and the work that Advocates of Sacred is doing is reclaiming certain parts of the English language as our own, because with reconciliation, for us, that's saying that a combination of coordinated actions or efforts to acknowledge, accept, and recover the truth from the original traumatic event or experience to reclaim a sustainable natural order, promoting peace, and employing cause and effect. And so we're saying that correlation doesn't equal causation. We're saying that due to, so here's an example of reconciliation, just because I'm not sure what the Google definition is. Here's what we're saying. It is based on creation stories. We're saying that the reconciliation of Raven that stole the sun, that story, there's a lot of reconciliations in that story. There's the reconciliation of how the sun ended up in the sky, the work that the Raven had to sacrifice of himself, and the woman that carried him, the grandfather, the father, chief, person who kept all the stars. So there's a lot of reconciliations that had to happen for us to have the sun in the sky based on that creation story. Other parts of reconciliation that are possible are knowing that certain ailments, accidents, and injuries of ourselves, of what we experience, are not the first. We know that at some point in our ancestors' lives, these same exact injuries, ailments, or accidents have happened. And if the opportunity comes to us through conflict of the accident, ailment, or injury, we get to fully recover that initial rooted trauma that happened, to reconcile it and figure it out so that our grandchildren's grandchildren and their grandchildren don't have to deal with it, that we've already recovered that particular trauma. We've already reconciled that particular hardship. I know we're saying a lot because we do a lot and we certainly ask for a lot here at Advocates of Sacred. The fifth part of creation stories is there's always a service. So through service, there's a progressive reconstructing and restructuring of moral, spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional teaching achieved through the process of reconciliation. Furthermore, providing an equitable and inclusive return of service to the self and community as a collectivist culture. And so what we're saying is that through our creation stories, there's a trauma, there's a witness, there's a helper elder, reconciliation, and service. And sometimes the service part, after coming around full circle, the service can be for the self to heal, truly heal, sustain that healing, and be able to share that with their children, be able to share that with their family, be able to share that with their community. And that's a service, right? If we can promote health and wellness and reconciliation within ourselves, then let that be contagious. So we acknowledge that within every tradition and or creation story, there are these 5 parts: trauma, witness, helper, reconciliation, and service. The process of evolving through the 5 parts motivates the teller and the listener to resonate with the original provisions and purpose of first narratives. So Taksha Blue by Hilbert, who's Upper Skagit, she used to say that when you tell a story, the listener's response should exhale a long, deep breath, like, like, wow, like what a relief. She would also say that it would be echoing the cause and effect. So consequently, first narratives is a traditional healing modality that we get to heal through going through the process, through going through those 5 parts of the story, that we get to put ourselves into that story. We get to put whatever situation we're experiencing in life into that story and help us make sense of it. Through that, we get to heal. So that's how and why traditional creation stories, first narratives, are a necessity and a first aid. So we want to invite you to learn and share first narratives as well as first foods, first plants, medicines. And is there any questions or comments or concerns before we move on? Okay. Okay, so here's a short list. So in the picture, there's red elderberry, polypore mushroom, stinging nettle, and princess pine. So Advocates of Sacred has been working diligently to be in the woods, to partner with other folks who are in the woods, meet up with them on the side of the freeway, or do doorstep drop-offs for some of these first foods. And we have a great amount of first plants, first medicines. Here in the shop, we have tinctures, we have salves, we have been discovering plant medicines that haven't been employed or occupied in decades. Since the early 1900s, we've been citing medical journals and talking to naturopathic providers, and just doing a whole lot of research on some of our first plants and medicines that we used to use traditionally here in the Pacific Northwest. It's been so exciting. And so I'm just going to list some of these plants and first foods that we have here. So there's nuts and seeds. There's pine nuts, hazelnuts, black walnuts, hickory, pecan, pumpkin, sunflower, and hemp. Vegetables, or what we consider vegetables just because of the cellular structure and nutritional benefits of these particular plants, is ginseng, chives, dandelions, little barley, maple sap, maygrass, sage, sunflowers, wild rice, squash, blue corn, beans, wild lettuce, and sea asparagus. Tons of fruits. Tons of fruits. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, I'll list them. So huckleberries, blueberries, blackberries, wild strawberries, elderberries, chokecherries, American grape, salmon berries, buffalo berries, plums, prickly pear, mulberries, pumpkins, crab apples, thimbleberries, lots of different seafood. When the tide's out, the table's set. And we like to start with the 5 salmon, the 5 species of salmon, and of course shellfish, octopus, shark, herring eggs, yummy salmon eggs, whale, cod, and seal grease in particular. And then herbs, teas, and roots. So these can be foods, and they can also be medicines. So wild asparagus, cattail, lettuce, camas, wapato, bracken, corn, nettle, bare root, cedar, lavender, Hudson Bay swamp tea, seaweed, yew, and it's a Y-E-W. And there's like, oh, there's 4 more that we've been discovering that I'm not comfortable with sharing as practicing partnering with them, because we're finishing research on them, but these are the 4 that have been lost, that haven't been employed in our region in almost 100 years now. Then there's fermented foods, or delicacies. So that's the best delicacy of all is breast milk, and then stink eggs, abalone, urchin, fish grease or animal grease, essential oils, saps, blood of trees, leaves of trees, bare root, princess pine, osha, and then the wild game, so buffalo, deer, elk, mountain goat, bear, grouse, pheasant, prairie chicken, ptarmigan, ducks. And, that's just a short list, just to hopefully get you folks started and being curious about what you can eat as a first food, being curious about maybe where you can forage for that, or what you can barter for some wild game if you're a meat eater. Just a very short list, and I encourage you to also do your own research and find out what some of your first foods can be, depending on what region of the states you live in, depending on what region your family originates from. And next slide. Perfect. So, and before we move forward, are there any questions or comments or?
So, Lana, the worry I have about traditional foods is that if too many people learn about them, they'll be over-harvested.
Sorry, were you saying if too many people forage for traditional foods, then they'll be over-harvested?
Yes, that's my worry.
Okay. And what particular food are you curious about? I've actually, that was my first worry in 2016 when I started researching the benefits of first foods. Is there a particular food, or?
Well, just in general, the invaders that came just overwhelmed the indigenous populations here with their numbers. And
right.
So I'm afraid the same thing will happen with the traditional foods. Or if all these invaders start eating their traditional foods, will there be enough for everyone? Right.
Well, that's a good question. And we've talked about that. We've gone around the table about that in particular. And we have a feeling that what you're calling the invaders, like white society or non-indigenous folks. I'm not sure who the invaders are, but what we've come to is that it'll most likely be the indigenous folks that will be eating our first foods. Some of the tastes are very, very bitter. Some of the, even like being out foraging is a lot of work. It's not easy to get bare root, to get osha, to get Indian hellebore, to find princess pine, to find Oregon grape roots. Like I was saying, there's particular times of the year that you need to partner with certain plants to harvest them, to forage for them. And I just don't see that kind of discipline and commitment from invader type.
Yeah, Solana, do you mind if I add something? When we were doing research also about this, and one of the things that we discovered, like just one example, I mean, there's several, but one example is with like the mushrooms. In fact, I was looking at someone's page, and one of the things that's happened is even on the non-native web pages that are showing how to harvest, for example, all different kinds of mushrooms, and they are very careful to share or not share certain information, because once they did, it was all non-natives that were actually going out and over harvesting to the point where they used to go, they completely wiped it out. And so this has happened, you know, with the salmon, with the buffalo, you know, with the trees being cut down all across the nation. So the non-indigenous people have been doing this since they landed. And so that's been a concern. And so when we've had people give presentations, we don't ask them to share where they're getting their, where they're harvesting, because we know people will go out and take them and then they share it with others, just like what's happening with the water up in Linwood, that well. And now the lines are so long, it takes forever to get water. So, and that's because everybody's telling everybody, and that's what happens. And so they just take over. And that's what happened with my father's village. They just take over the land. They want the gold, or they want the timber, or they want the salmon or whatever, and then they just take it over. They take it from us. So those are some of the concerns that Jonathan's been talking about. So.
Yeah, okay, that's crystal clear. Thank you, Ilani, for elaborating on that. And not that we have a solution, Jonathan and Ilani and Connie, but Advocates of Sacred is actually looking to put some teeth in the individual. Ilani, you're familiar with this, the individual Indian civil rights, treaty rights, being able to forage and harvest, and also being able to call when we catch other folks with our plants, with our medicines, and that's a process in itself. There's health initiatives that have to be written and passed. There's bills and partnerships and relationships that have to be followed. We have to play their game. We have to take it and write it down for them to have some truth for them. And yeah, I agree. The knowledge.
And also, let me just add one more thing is, I have multiple friends on different reservations, and they're also experiencing it. There's non-natives going on the reservation and actually taking from them, and it's not their place to be doing that. So they're like taking their fish or their shellfish. So they're going right onto the reservation and just taking whatever they want.
That's horrible.
Yeah. So that's another issue.
That's a whole other, that's awful. And but no, I think that we do need to be made aware of what's happening among our relatives, especially trying to protect our plants, our first foods in that relationship. It's no different protecting the roots on the mountain, the nettles on the, by the valley, the camas in the plateau, than protecting mom breastfeeding her baby. There should be no difference. There needs to be just as much activism, just as much value and truth in what we say and how we say it. And that's why Advocates of Sacred is diligently, we keep our maps private. We keep where we actually do the digging and the foraging and the harvesting, and the protocol to go obtain our plants and medicines is for the family. When you come to my house, when you come to our shop, there's a certain protocol around the kitchen. There's a certain protocol around the plants that are drying or hanging or in tinctures. And we don't talk about location. We don't talk about the process that it took to get to that physical place. We do get to share with each other the love and the peace and tranquility and evidence from the cause and effect of what it does for us, for the family, for the matrilineal society. Missing the water in the canoe this year, breastfeeding mamas. I just got to see and meet the newest addition to my family, the second granddaughter, back in May. And it's so special. And it's harvesting the plants, being part of First Foods and the creation stories in particular, being able to share this traditional medicine is not more important than her. And it's all for her. and it's for her grandchildren's grandchildren, that we get to talk about these things, that we get to talk about our fears and our worries, and hopefully be able to strategize at some point exactly how we can level up, and show what we're willing to do to protect our relationship with our plants, with our medicines, with our foods, what we're willing to do to truly advocate through the pandemic, through the civil unrest. I just know that Advocates of Sacred is well aware of the threats and the traumas and the generational fear and the misbeliefs, the false knowings that have been passed on. And we are well aware of what it takes to overcome and recover and sustain our first relationships with mom, with baby, their plants, with our helpers, with their stories, and be able to share and reinterpret those teaching and those remindings for the people, in hopes that this will be nothing new 20, 30 years from now, that we won't have to have presentations on traditional medicines, because it'll be our medicines. It'll be our way. We got to do the work and reclaim certain partnerships, our first aids and the importance of them. And so just concluding, our bodies, our minds, our emotions, our spirits, and our entire selves always want to heal. Always, always. I know that all of us have cut our hand or nicked our elbow at some point, and right away you bleed, right away it swells, right away your body starts to heal itself, and you have nothing to do with that. It does it on its own. That's what happens inside of us all the time. That's what happens when a trauma or event, emotional experience happens. Most of the time we block it out so that we can keep getting our job done. Most of the time we block it out so that we can promote our work and keep going forward. Our body holds on to that trauma event or experience and wants to heal. And we know that there's a basis of emotional intelligence. We call it mindsight. We also know that there's a level of empathy, insight, and integration that has to happen. And through the first narratives process, through partnering, and I say partnering in all sincerity, with our plants, our medicines, and first foods, there's a lot of integration. There's a presence of emotions and thoughts and differentiating the two. So next slide. So just to wrap it up, the blanket in the first slide and the image of the longhouse and the potlatch that Jeff was asking about are prime examples of power of voice and choice and the work that it's taken to overcome genocide, adversity, and compounded traumas, and the true desire for healing and coming together. And through time, Advocates of Sacred has learned and noticed that segregation is not sustainable, and nor is it equitable, which means it's not true, which means it's going to always fail. It's going to always fail to segregate our powers, to segregate our mind from our emotions, from our body, from our spirit. And we want to restore a natural order of that relationship within ourselves, to alleviate mental illness, deduce rigidity and chaos, and truly reconcile our first relationships with each other, with our natural protocol, with our first stories, with our first plants, our medicines, and our first aids. So again, this is all possible. This is what we've been doing. And we are so honored to have shared this hour with you today in radical humility. Thanks for meeting us online and inviting us to share some of our knowings with you, hopefully serving you, healing ourselves and our families and Mother Earth. My hands go up to all of you.
There is a question. Could you share about the importance of breast milk?
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh. The importance of breast milk. That's my favorite one. So breast milk has a mom's antibodies from her body. So our antibodies is what helps us fight off infection, helps plasticity in our brain, helps release oxytocin to mom to help her through the pain. It physiologically helps mom heal any sexual traumas. It physiologically helps heal that. in her body. It bonds mom and baby. The fact that baby has to drink milk when mom's eating is so that mom gets oxytocin, which allows her to get more nutrition from the food she's eating because she's breastfeeding at the same time. Babies are so primal and so amazingly intelligent and so advanced in their little modalities and when they cry, when they want to drink milk, when mom's having a hard time, babies will want mom because they know that as soon as she picks them up, as soon as she starts to nurse them, she gets pain relief, she gets love, she gets oxytocin, and baby gets that security. So it's a win-win. Breast milk it's constantly being made in mom's body to suit the needs of the baby. It's constantly being, your breasts around the nipples have these little sensors, like little fingers that go inside of baby and know if baby's teething, if baby has a germ coming. So your breast milk gets to make more antibodies. There's a lot of protein, calories, good sugars, good fats, good, amazing superfood for baby. And it's supply and demand. So mom could actually feed more than one baby. Mom can feed an entire village and sustain them and herself as long as she's drinking a certain amount of water. Mom's body is going to be flooded with oxytocin, flooded with endorphins, flooded with positive adrenaline to keep going through that process. So breast milk benefits are the best, are the absolute best. Best start for babies, best start for mom, especially through sexual trauma. Best start at advocating for our first foods. And babies remember nursing. Babies remember drinking their mom's milk. And it's just so precious when they do. So precious.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that concludes it. I don't see any other questions. So I think that wraps it up. And we want to thank you so much, Solana, for your presentation. And Ganesh.
Yes.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Dove. And Solana, thank you so much. Ganesh.
Thank you.
Okay.